Wow, okay. So, looks like someone's been doing their homework, huh? This is a lot on like reading people, analyzing how they act and why they do the things they do. It seems like, from what I've seen at least, we've got some good stuff here for people who want to get better at communicating, negotiating, heck, maybe even figuring themselves out a bit better. Some of this stuff really caught my eye: microexpressions, the shadow self,
Yeah.
even this idea that our homes, like the way we decorate and stuff, can tell us as much about a person as what they say.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely an interesting area. And you hit the nail on the head. There's a lot of potential here. Just imagine, like, what if you could go into all your relationships, your work, even just talking to people at the store and kind of have this deeper sense of what's making them tick?
For sure. But let's be honest, haven't we all had those times where we totally misread someone? Like, you think your friend is ignoring you, but really they were just, I don't know, stressed about work or something. Makes you wonder how much we can actually know about what's going on in someone else's head.
Right. Oh, absolutely. We can't just go off gut feeling all the time. That's how we get things like confirmation bias, where we're only seeing what we expect to see, not what's really there. And if you don't know how someone usually acts, it's easy to get the wrong idea about why they're doing something.
Oh, speaking of how people usually act, one of the sources mentioned this reading the mind and the eyes test. It was developed by Simon Baron Cohen. The whole idea is you judge someone's emotions just by looking at their eyes, like a quick glance. We'll put a link to the test in the show notes. It's a fun way to see how good you are at picking up on those little, emotional hints.
Yeah, it is a good one. It really shows how we can use a framework, a model, or something to like get past just guessing and have a more, structured way to understand people.
Yeah.
And speaking of frameworks, let's look at some of the ones that can help us figure out those hidden motivations, the things that drive us, even when we don't realize it.
Ooh, yes. Like the shadow self. I'm thinking of that classic midlife crisis thing, when someone buys a sports car out of the blue or makes some big life change. It's like some part of them they've been ignoring suddenly bursts out.
That's a perfect example of how Carl Jung's idea of the shadow self can show up. The shadow is all those parts of ourselves that we've repressed, unconscious stuff. It's like if you can imagine holding a beach ball underwater, how it keeps pushing to come up.
I like that visual. So how can you tell when someone is acting from that shadow part of themselves? What are like the signs to look for?
It can come out in different ways. You might see sudden outbursts or reactions that seem way too big for the situation, or even projection, where we're seeing our own faults in other people instead of facing them in ourselves. The point is, sometimes what seems irrational is actually coming from these deeper unconscious things.
So instead of judging someone, we can try to see them through this lens of like, okay, maybe this is their shadow self coming out. Seems like that could lead to more understanding, more compassion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's recognizing that everyone has a shadow. And if we understand that, it can open up deeper levels of communication.
Okay, so that's the shadow self. Another thing I found interesting was this whole idea of the inner child. That part of us that still has all the like emotional baggage from when we were kids. It's like sometimes when you're arguing with someone, it feels like you're dealing with a 5-year-old throwing a tantrum, even though they're, a grown up.
Uh-huh. Oh, I know what you mean. It really is like that sometimes. This inner child concept is basically saying our early experiences really shape how we react emotionally, often without us even realizing it. Being aware of this, both in ourselves and others, can make a huge difference, especially when we're trying to communicate or work through a conflict.
So what are like the giveaways that someone's reacting from that inner child place? What kind of behavior should we be looking out for?
Well, you mentioned tantrums. Defensiveness is another big one, or having emotional reactions that are out of proportion to what's happening.
So instead of getting caught up in like the drama of the tantrum, you can try to see that scared or hurt inner child that's driving it, right? But that takes some serious awareness.
It does. But if we can recognize that inner child, both in ourselves and others, it helps us de-escalate those conflicts, communicate better and build those stronger, more understanding relationships.
Okay, so we've got the shadow self, we've got the inner child, two really interesting ways to understand those hidden forces that drive how people act. But what about those motivations that are more, out in the open, the things that make us decide what to do every day?
Well, that's where we get into the pleasure pain principle.
Yeah.
Basically, it says that we're all wired to seek out pleasure and avoid pain in every single area of life.
Makes sense. We work to earn money because we enjoy what we can do with it pleasure. We avoid touching a hot stove because it hurts pain.
Yeah,
Pretty basic, right?
exactly. But it's actually a bit more complicated than that. It's our perceptions of pleasure and pain that really drive our choices. One of the sources talked about chapulines, which are like grasshoppers that are seasoned with chili and eaten as a snack in Mexico.
Okay.
A lot of people would be grossed out just thinking about eating grasshoppers, right?
Yeah.
They picture it being crunchy and disgusting, maybe even dangerous.
Yeah, I can see how that mental image would trigger that whole avoid pain response.
Right. But the truth is, chapulines are totally safe to eat and actually pretty nutritious.
Mhm.
Millions of people enjoy them. So what we're seeing here is that our mental image of something can actually override the possibility of us actually enjoying it. And this happens all the time. We don't try new things, take risks, or go after opportunities
Mm.
because we're focused on the potential pain, like fear of failing or being judged or even just feeling uncomfortable.
Oh, totally. I've definitely been there. So how do we get past those limiting perceptions?
Well, that's where understanding the power of immediacy comes in. Our brains are wired to prioritize pleasure and pain in the short term, even if it means messing up our long-term well-being. It explains why we procrastinate, why we indulge in unhealthy habits, why we make impulsive decisions that we regret later.
That makes so much sense. That piece of cake is so tempting in the moment, even if you know you'll feel bad later. Or that extra hour of sleep is awesome now, even if it means you'll be rushing around like crazy in the morning.
It's this constant tug-of-war between instant gratification and the consequences down the road. And this is where Freud's idea of the id versus the superego comes in. The I is like all those basic impulsive desires, while the superego is our conscience, the part that wants us to reach those long-term goals and be a good person.
So it's like the classic angel and devil on your shoulders battling it out.
Exactly. And understanding this dynamic can be really helpful when you're trying to read people. Think about someone who knows smoking is bad for them, but they keep craving that nicotine that's the I winning over the superego.
That's a great example. So by understanding this interplay of pleasure, pain, and immediacy, can we actually predict how people will choose?
To a certain extent, yeah. And that's where having like a big picture model of motivation can be really helpful. Something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It helps us understand the different levels of needs people have and how those needs influence their behavior. It's often shown as a pyramid with the most basic needs at the bottom.
Okay, I'm picturing a pyramid. What's at the base, like the foundation?
At the very bottom, you have physiological needs, things like food, water, shelter, sleep. Above that, we have safety needs, security, stability, protection.
Makes sense. You can't really focus on anything else if you're starving or feeling unsafe.
Exactly. Once those basic needs are taken care of, we move up to the third level, love and belonging. This is about connection, intimacy, friendship.
So we're talking about those core social needs, like wanting to feel loved and accepted.
Yes, exactly. Then above that, you've got esteem needs, things like self-respect, confidence, achievement, being recognized by others. And finally, right at the top of the pyramid, we have self-actualization, which is about fulfilling your potential, going after your passions, living a meaningful life.
Wow, so it's like climbing this ladder of needs, and you can't reach the top unless those lower rungs are secure. That's a powerful image.
It is. And from a people reading perspective, it's fascinating to think about how watching someone's needs in the moment can help us understand what's driving them. Let's say you have a counselor at a women's shelter. She might meet women who are at very different levels on this pyramid. Some might be focused on just surviving food, shelter, safety. Others might be looking for connection and support.
So the counselor would change her approach depending on what that woman's most urgent need is at that moment. Trying to talk about self-actualization with someone who's still in survival mode wouldn't really make sense.
Exactly. And it highlights a key point about Maslow's hierarchy. We can't all be operating at the top of the pyramid if our basic needs aren't being met. If we get this, we can communicate with more empathy, offer support that's actually helpful, and build stronger connections.
This is all so insightful. Okay, so far we've talked about the shadow self, the inner child, pleasure and pain, and now this Maslow's hierarchy. What other frameworks should we have in our people reading toolkit?
Oh, there are definitely more. When you come across behavior that's, hard to understand, thinking about ego defenses could be really helpful. It's the idea that when we're faced with tough truths about ourselves or the world, our ego jumps in to protect us, kind of like a bodyguard shielding us from those painful blows.
Yeah, I can totally see how that plays out. Like someone who's being abused, but they insist it's not happening, even when the signs are obvious. Or that friend who refuses to admit they have a drinking problem, even though it's messing up their life.
Those are perfect examples. Denial, refusing to accept what's real because it just hurts too much. That's a really common one. Another big one is repression, where we kind of shove those uncomfortable thoughts and feelings down into our unconscious. It's like sweeping all that unpleasant stuff under the rug, hoping it'll just disappear.
And then there's projection, right, where we see our own flaws in other people instead of dealing with them ourselves, like the person who's always accusing everyone else of being jealous when they're the jealous one.
Exactly. It's so much easier to point the finger outward than to look inward.
So we've got denial, repression, and projection. Are there any other defense mechanisms we should be watching out for?
Yeah, a few more that pop up all the time. Rationalization is a big one. That's where we make excuses for our behavior even when we know it's not okay. Like a student who blames their bad grade on the teacher instead of admitting they didn't study. And then there's displacement, where we redirect our emotions onto someone who's, a safer target. Like, you have a bad day at work and come home and yell at your family even though they didn't do anything wrong.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been on the receiving end of that one. It seems like recognizing these ego defenses, both in ourselves and other people, that's really important if you want to have honest communication and develop self-awareness.
Absolutely. It helps us get past those surface level explanations and figure out what's really going on underneath.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with these like psychological forces that shape how we act. But what about the things we can actually see? Like body language, is it really possible to read someone's mind just by watching how they move?
Well, it's not mind reading literally, but body language is a powerful way we communicate. And the cool thing is, it's often unconscious. So our bodies might be saying something our words are trying to hide.
So like when someone says, "I'm fine," but their face is all scrunched up, their body language is telling a different story.
Exactly. The research on this is really interesting. One of the sources talked about Joe Navarro, a former FBI agent who spent years studying nonverbal communication. He talks about how much we can learn just by paying attention to those little cues.
One of the things that stood out to me was microexpressions. You know, those super quick facial expressions that some people say can reveal your true emotions. How do those work? And can we actually learn to spot them?
Yeah, microexpressions are like these tiny flashes of emotion. They happen so fast you often miss them, but they can tell you a lot. Imagine someone who's trying to act calm and collected, but for a split second, you see anger flash across their face before they cover it up with a smile. That microexpression might be showing some underlying tension or disagreement they're trying to hide.
So how do we even start to notice these microexpressions? Are there like telltale signs to look for?
There are. A genuine smile, for instance, uses the muscles around the eyes. They crinkle up. It's called a Duchenne smile. A fake smile only engages the muscles around the mouth, so it doesn't reach the eyes.
So it's all about the crinkly eyes. What about other emotions? Like if someone is sad or scared or disgusted, do those have their own microexpressions too?
They do. Sadness often shows up as drooping eyelids and a downturned mouth. Fear, you might see raised eyebrows and wider eyes. And disgust often involves a wrinkled nose and a raised upper lip.
Wow, it's like learning a whole new language. I'm ready to go out and start analyzing everyone's face for these micro expressions. But before I get carried away, our sources did say we should be careful. Micro expressions aren't like foolproof lie detectors, right?
They can point to hidden emotions, but it doesn't automatically mean the person is lying. They might show a quick flash of fear because they're nervous, not because they're trying to trick you.
So context is key, as always. It's not just about the micro expressions themselves, but the situation and how the person's acting overall.
Exactly. And that leads us to body language more broadly. It's about looking at the whole picture, posture, gestures, movements to get what someone's communicating without words. It's not just about figuring out individual gestures, but seeing how it all fits together.
So how do we even begin to make sense of this whole body language thing? Are there like any guidelines we can follow?
One helpful idea is that our limbs, the way we move them, often show unconscious attempts to protect ourselves, to defend ourselves. Think about things like touching your face, rubbing your neck, fidgeting game. Those are called pacifying behaviors, and they usually mean stress, insecurity, or feeling uncomfortable.
Oh, like when you're nervous and you find yourself twisting your ring or playing with your hair without even realizing it, you're trying to like soothe yourself.
Exactly. And then you have blocking gestures, things like crossing your arms, turning away, or putting something between you and the other person. Those can mean you disagree, you're uncomfortable, or you want to get out of the conversation.
It's like our bodies are instinctively putting up these physical walls to match the emotional walls we might be building.
Haha, that's a great way to put it. And then, of course, there are those approach and avoidance behaviors. Leaning in shows interest, engagement, wanting to connect. Leaning back or turning away could mean disengagement, boredom, or needing some space.
So, by watching those subtle shifts in posture and how close someone is to you, you can get a sense of how comfortable they are and how interested they are. But as with everything else, context matters here too, right?
Oh, for sure. What might be a sign of discomfort for one person could be totally normal for someone else. That's why figuring out that baseline behavior we talked about earlier is so important.
So, before we jump to conclusions, we need to see how someone normally acts and then look for anything that's different from that. Makes sense. Now, our sources talked about this idea of looking for clusters and congruence
Yeah.
when you're trying to piece together all these body language signals. What does that mean exactly?
It means that instead of getting hung up on one little gesture, we need to look for patterns.
Hmm.
And congruence is about how well someone's words match their body language. If they're saying one thing, but their body language is shouting something completely different, that's a big red flag.
Oh, like the classic example of someone saying, I'm not angry, but their face is red, their fists are clenched, and their voice is shaky. Their body's totally contradicting what they're saying.
Exactly. That lack of congruence, it could be a strong sign that someone's being deceptive, hiding their true feelings, or struggling with some kind of inner conflict.
So we need to be like detectives, searching for those inconsistencies between what people say and how they act.
That's it. And when we're talking about clusters, research has actually found some pretty common patterns of behavior that can be helpful in understanding what someone's really up to. For example, aggression often shows up as a bunch of behaviors together, maybe confrontational gestures, getting in your space, a loud voice, and staring you down.
I can picture that someone who stands too close, talks over you, uses those aggressive hand gestures. Their whole vibe is basically, I'm in charge and you better listen up.
Exactly. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, you might see a cluster of submissive behaviors, things like making yourself small, avoiding eye contact, speaking quietly, and always letting others make the decisions.
That'd be like the person who apologizes constantly, doesn't want to take up space, and lets everyone else call the shots. Their body language is practically screaming, I lack confidence.
Exactly. And of course, there are clusters of behavior that signal openness and trust. This might be relaxed limbs, uncrossed arms and legs, genuine smiles, looking you in the eye and leaning in.
I can see that one too. The person who greets you with a real smile, makes eye contact, leans in to listen. Their body's saying, I'm warm, I'm open, I'm ready to engage.
You got it.
Yeah.
And lastly, our sources mention clusters of behavior that often show up with deception. This is where you often see that mismatch between words and actions, along with those pacifying behaviors, and maybe sudden changes in how they're acting.
So we're on the lookout for those signs of nervousness, discomfort, and inconsistency that could mean someone's hiding something. But we gotta remember, these are just general patterns, right? Everyone's different and context matters.
You're absolutely right. We have to be careful not to overgeneralize or jump to conclusions based on just a few things we see. But if we understand these common clusters and we're looking for that consistency between words and actions, we can get a much better understanding of what people's true intentions are.
This is all so fascinating. We've gone from microexpressions to whole body language to these clusters of behavior. Is there anything else we can look at to get a read on someone? Like, can their personality type give us clues about how they'll act?
That's a great question. Our sources actually go into two major frameworks for personality that can be super helpful. The Big Five personality traits and the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, along with something called the Keirsey temperaments. Have you ever heard of those?
I've definitely heard of the Myers-Briggs, but I don't think I could explain it. And I'm not familiar with the Big Five or Keirsey temperaments at all.
Okay, well, let's start with the Big Five, since that one's a bit more straightforward. It basically says there are 5 core personality traits that everyone has to different degrees: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Each one's a spectrum, and we all fall somewhere on that spectrum for each trait.
So it's not like you're either open or closed, conscientious or careless. There's more to it than that.
Exactly. Let's take openness, for instance. People high in openness are curious, imaginative, love new experiences. Think adventurous travelers, people who read a lot, always up for trying new things. People low in openness are usually more conventional, practical, and prefer routine. They might be hesitant to try new foods, they stick with familiar activities, they like tradition.
So if you know how open someone is, you can get clues about their approach to life in general, what they're interested in, even how they make decisions.
Right. Now let's move on to conscientiousness. People high in conscientiousness are the organized ones, disciplined, goal-oriented. Think about those meticulous planners, those reliable workers always showing up on time. People who are low in conscientiousness, they're more spontaneous, flexible, not as concerned with order and structure.
So understanding someone's level of conscientiousness can tell you something about how they work, whether they're reliable, even how they approach relationships.
Exactly. Now, we've already talked about extroversion, outgoing, energetic, loving social situations. People low in extroversion, they're more introverted. They like quiet environments. They enjoy doing things alone. And social situations can be draining.
So knowing someone's level of extroversion helps you understand their social preferences, how they communicate, even what kind of work environment would be good for them.
Right. Now, agreeableness. People high in agreeableness are compassionate, cooperative, and trusting. They might be peacemakers, good listeners, and always willing to lend a hand. People low in agreeableness, though, they might be more skeptical, more assertive, and not so concerned with keeping the peace.
So knowing how agreeable someone is, that can be helpful when you're in a conflict or trying to build rapport or predicting how much they'll cooperate.
Exactly. And last but not least, we have neuroticism. People high in neuroticism tend to be anxious, worry a lot, and their emotions are kind of all over the place. They might get stressed out easily, be sensitive to criticism, and react emotionally. People low in neuroticism are more emotionally stable, resilient, and calm under pressure.
So knowing someone's level of neuroticism can help you understand their emotional sensitivity, how they handle stress, and how they approach challenges in general. But again, it's important to remember that these are just general tendencies. Everyone's different.
Absolutely. But by understanding the Big Five, we can get some really useful insights into those core personality traits, which can help us understand what motivates people and how they're likely to act. It's like having a cheat sheet for understanding the building blocks of someone's personality.
Love that.
Yeah.
Now, what about the Myers-Briggs? Like I said, I've heard of it, but I don't really get how it works.
The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, is based on 4 pairs of opposite preferences. The first one is extroversion versus introversion, which we've already talked about with the Big Five. The second one is sensing versus intuition. People who prefer sensing, they're all about concrete facts, details, and practical stuff. They might be really good at observing, remembering specific information, and following instructions. People who prefer intuition, they're more focused on patterns, possibilities, and the big picture. They might be really good at brainstorming, seeing connections that other people miss, and coming up with creative solutions.
So sensing is like, what is it? Well, intuition is more like, why is it and what could it be?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Now, the third pair is thinking versus feeling. People who lean towards thinking, they prioritize logic, analysis, making objective decisions. They might be great at solving problems, debating, staying calm under pressure. People who lean towards feeling, they put more emphasis on values, empathy, and how decisions affect other people. They might be really good at building rapport, mediating conflicts, and creating a harmonious environment.
So thinking is like head over heart, while feeling is more heart over head.
Exactly. And finally, you have judging versus perceiving. People who prefer judging, they like structure, order, and getting things decided. They might be good at planning, organizing, and making decisions quickly. People who prefer perceiving, they like to stay flexible, spontaneous, keeping their options open. They might be good at adapting to change, brainstorming, and exploring all the possibilities.
So judging is all about control, and perceiving is more about going with the flow.
You got it. Now, the MBTI combines these 4 pairs to come up with 16 distinct personality types, each with its own set of strengths, weaknesses, and typical tendencies.
Wow, 16 types. That's a lot to remember. Is there a simpler way to think about these personality patterns?
There is. The Curie temperaments group those 16 types into 4 broader categories: guardians, artisans, idealists, and rationals.
Okay, so let's break those down. What are the key things about each one?
Guardians are practical, responsible, and they value tradition and security. They might be reliable workers, community leaders, devoted family members.
Yeah.
They're often seen as like the backbone of society, upholding those core values and traditions.
Interesting. So stability and structure are super important to them. What about artisans?
Artisans are spontaneous, adaptable, and they're all about action and creativity. Think skilled performers, talented artists, or entrepreneurs, always looking for a new challenge. Think the free spirits, the adventurers, always pushing boundaries and looking for new experiences.
I can see how they'd be drawn to those creative fields and wanting to start their own businesses. What about idealists?
Idealists are compassionate, empathetic, and they're driven by a desire to make the world a better place. Think about inspiring teachers, dedicated social workers, people who are passionate about social justice. They're the dreamers, the visionaries, the ones trying to make a positive difference.
They sound like the heart-centered change makers. And what about rationals, the last one?
Rationals are analytical, independent, and always looking for knowledge and understanding. Think brilliant scientists, innovative engineers, those strategic thinkers who are always trying to improve things and solve complex problems. They're the logicians, the problem solvers, the ones who want to understand the why behind everything.
So each of these temperaments has its own unique set of strengths and things that motivate them. It's fascinating to think about how these temperaments show up in different areas of life. But it's important to remember these are just broad categories, right? People within each temperament can be very different.
Absolutely. And we have to be careful not to put people in these rigid boxes based on these frameworks. But the QC temperaments can give us some really valuable clues about people's core values, what drives them, and how they're likely to act. It's like having a roadmap for understanding all the complexities of human personality.
That's a great way to think about it. But like you said, it's important to remember that these personality frameworks are just tools, not labels to stick on people. And like any tool, you got to use them carefully and knowing that they have their limits.
Exactly. It's not about trying to put people into categories. It's about using these frameworks to deepen our understanding so we can connect better. And that brings us to this really cool aspect of reading people that goes beyond just words and gestures. It's about looking for clues in their lives, their environments, their things, their choices.
It's like that saying, you can tell a lot about a person by their shoes, but obviously it's way more than just shoes.
Right. Our sources talk about this idea that our clothes, how we decorate our homes, the things we own, they all act as identity claims.
So it's like we're curating our surroundings to show who we are, or at least who we want people to think we are.
Exactly. And if we pay attention to these details, we can learn a lot about what people value, what's important to them, even how they're feeling.
Okay, let's get specific. What are some things we should look for when we're observing someone's style and their environment?
When it comes to clothes, pay attention to how formal or casual they dress, if they paid attention to the details, any status symbols they might be showing off, and the overall message they seem to be sending. Are their clothes all about comfort and being practical, or do they put a lot of emphasis on fashion and expressing themselves? Are they trying to blend in or stand out? Are they communicating something about their job, their social status, or their personality?
So it's not about judging their fashion sense, but trying to figure out what their clothes say about who they are and what's important to them.
You got it. And when you look at their home, see if you can get a sense of whether they're more open or closed off, how organized they are, any personal touches they've added, and the general vibe of the place. Is it warm and inviting or more minimalist and functional? Are there things that show their hobbies, interests, passions? Does it feel super ordered and controlled or more relaxed and lived in?
It's like you're a detective searching for clues that reveal their personality and how they live their life.
Exactly. But always remember context. A person's home might not be a true reflection of who they are, if they're just renting or if they share the space with other people. But even then, you can still find clues how they arrange their belongings, the personal touches, the books they have on display. It's about being observant and putting together the pieces of their life based on those little hints they leave behind.
Okay, so we can't talk about observing people without mentioning social media, right? It feels like everyone's trying to create this perfect image of themselves online. But can you really get to know someone through their social media? Or is it all just carefully chosen pictures and witty captions?
That's a great question. The research on this is actually pretty interesting. It seems like social media is a way people express themselves, and some studies have shown that it can reveal certain personality traits.
So it's not completely meaningless. There are real clues we can find in those posts and profiles.
Right. But we do have to think about the fact that online profiles are curated and that people can exaggerate or even be deceptive. People often show the side of themselves they want others to see, not necessarily the whole truth.
Yeah, so we should take those social media posts with a grain of salt, knowing that they might not be the whole story. But even with that, you're saying there are still some insights we can get. What should we be paying attention to?
One thing to look at is the kind of photos they post. Are they mostly positive and happy, or more negative or neutral? Someone who's always posting selfies from exotic places or perfectly arranged food, they might be more outgoing and concerned about image, whereas someone who shares more candid photos or things to think about, they might be more introspective and authentic.
So it's about going beyond just the surface and looking at the overall tone and message they're putting out there.
Exactly. And pay attention to what they say in their posts and captions. What values are they expressing? What are their interests? What emotions are they showing? Are they constantly looking for validation and attention? Or are they sharing more genuine experiences and insights?
It's like trying to read between the lines of their online persona to figure out what really matters to them.
Right. And also notice how often they post and how they interact.
Yeah.
Are they constantly posting and engaging with others, or are they more selective and quiet?
Someone who's always commenting on other people's stuff and sharing things that are going viral, they might be more extroverted and social. Whereas someone who rarely posts and only interacts with close friends, they might be more introverted and private.
Exactly. Just remember, social media is just one piece of the puzzle.
Mm.
But if we combine those online clues with what we see them doing in real life, we can get a much more complete picture of who they are.
It's about using those digital breadcrumbs to enhance our understanding, not to judge someone based only on their online persona. So beyond just observing, are there proactive things we can do to get a better read on someone?
Absolutely. Our sources talk about a really powerful technique that can help us uncover those hidden motivations, asking the right questions.
So you're saying we should actively engage with someone to get a better sense of who they are.
Exactly. And sometimes the most revealing questions are the ones that aren't so direct. The ones that get around people's defenses and uncover what they really desire and what they fear. It's like being a really good interviewer, asking those open-ended questions that encourage people to share without feeling pressured or like they're being interrogated.
I love that. Okay, give me an example. What's one of these magic questions?
One of the questions they suggest is, what kind of prize would you work hardest for, and what punishment would you work hardest to avoid?
Well, that's a good one. It gets right to the core of what makes someone tick their values, their desires, their fears.
Exactly. When we understand what they're striving for and what they're trying to avoid, we gain incredible insight into their core motivations. It's like understanding their personal carrot and sticks, what pulls them forward and what pushes them away.
Another question they suggest is, where do you spend money freely and where do you skimp? I can see how that would tell you a lot about someone's priorities and values.
Right. Someone who splurges on trips but is careful about clothes, they might prioritize adventure and exploring over things, whereas someone who invests in a fancy house but drives an old car might value comfort and stability over status and what other people think. By understanding where they put their resources, we can get a deeper understanding of what really matters to them.
It's like their spending habits give us a peek into their soul, revealing their desires and values.
Another question that gets people thinking is, what's your most meaningful achievement and your most meaningful failure? This taps into how they see themselves and how they view their wins and losses.
So someone who's proudest of building a successful business, they might value ambition, working hard, and being independent, whereas someone who regrets not following a passion might be afraid of failing, of being judged, or having regrets. It's about understanding those defining moments that have shaped their worldview and how they see themselves.
Exactly. Here's another one that can tell you a lot about someone's passions and what they don't like. What's effortless for you and what's exhausting.
Someone who finds it easy to connect with people, but gets tired doing detailed tasks. They might be more extroverted and people-oriented, while someone who loves doing things alone but finds social gatherings draining might be more introverted and introspective.
Precisely. And this next question can be incredibly revealing about someone's ideal self and what's important to them. If you could max out 3 personality traits, which would you choose?
Ooh, I like that one. Someone who chooses charisma, intelligence, and resilience, they probably want to be a leader and a problem solver, while someone who picks kindness, creativity, and humor might prioritize connection, expressing themselves, and making a positive difference.
Exactly. And this one can give us a glimpse into their worldview and what they care about. What charity would you donate millions to if you had to?
Someone who chooses an environmental charity, they probably care about the planet and sustainability, whereas someone who chooses an organization fighting poverty might value social justice and equality.
Right, by figuring out what causes they're passionate about, we can understand their values, their beliefs, even their sense of purpose.
These questions are so insightful. It's like we're opening up these secret compartments of their personality and how they see the world. But it's not just about their answers, right? It's also how they answer.
You're exactly right. Pay attention to their tone, their body language, how enthusiastic they are. Those nonverbal cues can be just as telling as their words.
It's about being an active listener, observing those subtle cues, and putting together the puzzle of who they are. Are there any other ways to get this kind of revealing information?
Our sources also suggest going even deeper by asking people to tell stories,
Stories, like fairy tales or something.
and not necessarily fairy tales, but asking someone to tell a story about a specific experience they've had, or even just a made-up situation, that could be super revealing. For example, you could ask, if you were an animal, what would you be and why?
That's a fun one. Someone who says a lion, they might identify with being strong, being a leader, being courageous, while someone who says a dolphin, they might value intelligence, being playful, and connection.
Exactly. It's not about taking their answer literally, but understanding the symbolism of what they're trying to express through those metaphors.
So it's like decoding the language of their subconscious, figuring out the deeper meaning behind the stories they choose.
Exactly. Another interesting one is, what's your favorite movie and why? That can tell you a lot about their moral compass, their outlook on the world, and even their aspirations.
Someone who loves action movies, they might like stories about heroes and justice, while someone who prefers romantic comedies might value connection, laughter, and happy endings.
You got it. This next question could be really telling about what someone finds important when things get tough. What would you rescue from a burning house?
Someone who grabs their photo albums, they might be all about memories and sentimental value, while someone who grabs their laptop, they might be focused on practical stuff and being able to work.
Exactly. And last but not least, this one can uncover someone's vulnerabilities and what they're truly afraid of. What scares you most?
Someone who's terrified of public speaking might be really self-conscious and scared of what people think, while someone who's scared of losing the people they love might prioritize connection and security above everything else.
Precisely. By understanding their fears, we can get insight into their deepest insecurities and what truly matters to them.
Wow, these story prompts are powerful. It's like we're opening up hidden chapters of their inner world.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about analyzing their stories like a therapist. It's about using them as a way to understand them better and connect with them on a deeper level.
So it's about listening with empathy, paying attention to those underlying themes, and using those stories to build stronger relationships.
That's it. Now, before we finish up this deep dive into reading people, we got to remember that all of these techniques, these frameworks, they're just tools. They're not going to magically reveal every thought and intention someone has.
So it's not about becoming some kind of mind reader, but rather a more skilled observer and interpreter of how people act.
Precisely. And like any skill, it takes practice, it takes patience, and it takes being willing to learn from when you get it wrong.
Don't beat yourself up if you misinterpret a microexpression or you get someone's personality type wrong. It's all part of the learning process.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the more in tune we become to those subtle cues, those underlying motivations, those patterns of behavior, and all of that helps us understand the people around us.
This has been such an amazing journey. We've looked at those hidden forces that shape our actions, the nonverbal languages we're all speaking, and those little clues that are hidden in plain sight. It feels like we've unlocked a whole new level of understanding about the people we interact with.
It really has been. And the amazing thing is, this whole process of trying to understand others has also been about, self-discovery. It's like we've been holding up a mirror to our own motivations, our biases, how we act.
That's so true. And to sum up the most important things we've learned, remember that reading people is a skill you can learn and get better at with practice. It's not about ditching your gut feeling, but about combining that with the frameworks we talked about to be more accurate in how you see people.
And while you're practicing, remember to check your own biases. None of us are perfect at reading people, and these techniques aren't about being perfect. They're about developing deeper understanding so we can connect with people in a more meaningful way.
I love that. So now that you've got all these new tools and insights, who are you going to observe more closely? Maybe that interesting coworker, that potential client, or even that mysterious stranger at your favorite coffee shop. Remember, the world is your laboratory, and there are endless possibilities for deeper understanding. Happy observing.
Yeah, it really has. And you know what's really cool? It's like this whole journey of trying to understand other people, it's also helped us understand ourselves better. Like we've been holding up a mirror to our own motivations, our blind spots, the way we act.
It really does feel that way. So to kind of sum up some of the key takeaways here, reading people is a skill, right? It's something you can actually get better at with practice. It's not about throwing your intuition out the window, but about using those frameworks we talked about, along with your gut feelings, to be more accurate.
And as you practice, don't forget to be aware of your own biases. We all have them. None of us are perfect mind readers. And these techniques aren't about, being perfect. They're about getting a deeper understanding so you can connect with people in a way that really matters.
That's so well said. So now that you've got all these new tools, all these insights, who are you going to, observe a little more closely? Maybe that coworker who always seems interesting, that potential client, or even just like that person you always see at your favorite coffee shop. Remember, the world's your lab, and there are so many opportunities to understand people better. Happy observing.